All right, hello everybody. I have something a little unexpected. I said I was going to read some Harlan Ellison, but I actually stumbled into something else that I thought was worth talking about. So I was working on an essay and I needed the name of a fake country. And as you can see, I was thinking, oh, fake country? Mises, right? Mises used Ruritania, right? And I was like, man, that's interesting, Ruritania. I wonder where Mises came up with it. I mean, it's entirely possible. Well, Mises is certainly capable, creative enough to come up with a good fake country name, but did he is the question. And so I went and looked it up. And it turns out that the name Ruritania, as like kind of a generic fictional European country, actually started back in 1894 with a book by a guy named Anthony Hope called The Prisoner of Zenda. And like apparently this book was massively popular. It turned into a whole genre of swashbuckling adventure novels that, Anthony Hope had a trilogy. There was a bunch of novels by other people. This ran all the way up through the 1920s. Ruritania became like a cultural icon of like any fictional European, vaguely Germanic kind of country. It was often parodied and satirized too by all kinds of, people whose names you've probably heard and whose names I'm blanking on, playwrights and so on and so forth. I mean, these are easy, earthy, fun fiction, which of course leads some people to downplay the value of such a thing just for entertainment purposes. But of course, the Prisoner of Zenda book was so popular that it was actually made into various plays and movies, but not so much recently, right? So I went and I said, well, let me read this book. It's public domain. I can find a copy for free and read up on it. And, I wasn't sure what I was going to get, but I found it to be fun, well-written, and very accessible for how old it was. It's written in very modern idiomatic English for the most part. There's no attempt to stand on pretense. The tone is conversational and flows very well. And yet at the same time, it has some artifacts that are kind of interesting as like historical, like, hey, this is an intermediate state between X and Y that I didn't realize existed. So the one example that I think I'll just highlight is that over on page 58 of the book, it's described a woman does something that is described as she courtesied. And you've probably heard the word curtsy, right? And, if you've heard it later in life, it's not a common word anymore, right? People don't curtsy anymore. But if you've heard it later in life, you might make the association that, oh, curtsy, that might be a corruption of courtesy. But it turns out, in fact, that, in 1894, or, very soon before 1894, that the word curtsy was still spelled and written as courtesied. So just kind of fun to see these little bits of English change over time kind of popping up and in unexpected places. So this particular novel is kind of a story of a switcheroo in Ruritania, a foreign country. The main perspective is a young English gentleman. And it's funny because when I opened this up, the first sentence of the book is this, quote, "I wonder when in the world you're going to do anything, Rudolph," said my brother's wife, end quote. And I kind of looked at the book and looked at myself and thought about where I am in the world and was like, oh, that's funny. I'm going to have to keep going with that. So the main character is the second son of a noble family in England. He has red hair and a long pointed nose. And, there's a point made in the book that, quote, "Many a man has cursed this red hair before now, ... but never a woman," end quote. So kind of, romantic in the old sense of the word, and kind of thing going on. But basically, his red hair and his nose come from the story of an old Ruritanian king who showed up a couple, like 100 or so years ago. He visited England and he left after fighting a duel with some English nobleman over the affections of that nobleman's wife. And that English family, of whom the main character is a member, has now and then a member show up that resembles that Ruritanian king every so often. In fact, they mention it early on in the book and say, quote, "Certainly this heredity we hear so much about is the finest scandalmonger in the world. It laughs at discretion and writes strange entries between the lines of the peerage," end quote. And so, at this point, this is another fun artifact, is that at this point, the idea of heredity, of genetics, was still in its infancy. And so they're like, oh, this newfangled idea of of heredity is doing this thing and making fun of this this noble family, whether they want it to or not, kind of thing. Very, very neat kind of element there. So the main character, as I mentioned, the main character's sister-in-law is like, when are you going to do anything? And he's like, I don't have to do anything. I have a reasonable income, and, I'm part of the peerage and yada, yada, yada. But, she kind of keeps nagging at him, and his response is, okay, fine. I'll go to Tyrol, which is a place that straddles Austria and Italy. And he says, I'll go to Tyrol, and I'll get some material for a book, and I'll write a book. And she says, oh, that's a great idea. You should do that. But, of course, he's not quite that responsible. So what he actually does is he takes a trip to France, and then instead of moving on to Tyrol, he goes toward Ruritania. And he ends up in this massive adventure where the future of the country, Ruritania that is, hangs in the balance. And, of course, the book that we're reading is his book that he wrote on that. After realizing that, like, hey, I said I was going to go get stuff to write a book, and I certainly got material, but, it's not the kind of book that my sister-in-law would approve of. The book is fun and funny. It has amusing uses of dialogue and props here and there, some good lines here and there that come back and forth and are fun and interesting. It has a fairly compact cast of characters, with the good guys and bad guys kind of pretty clearly delineated. The main character has two guys who are kind of on his side through most of through the book, as well as a couple other characters that are on his side but not in on the switcheroo. And then there's the person he's against, and that guy, Black Michael, the Duke of Ruritania, who also wants the throne, has 6 kind of guys that are working for him. And so those are kind of the main characters of the book. And even most of the 6 don't get much character development, but they're there as, they guarded this, or they did this, or they fought this guy, or whatever kind of thing. So, and some of the 6 that do get character are kind of fun because they're not distinctly on Black Michael's side necessarily, or they're kind of charming while still being on the bad guy's side. Quote, for my part, if a man must needs be a knave, I would have him a debonair knave, end quote. Stuff like that. Fun stuff. We get a lot of fighting with sword and revolver. It's very reminiscent of, like, Zorro, but a little bit later than Zorro because they're doing revolvers and not single-shot stuff. A lot of planning of escapes and jailbreaks, and, a lot of tense conversations between 2 people who know that each of them are playing a part, but they can't quite, reveal it, or else they'll be in trouble kind of thing. And we have intelligent foes, well-defended castles, cool action fights, and a lot of fun. So I was actually pleasantly surprised by this book, and, I'll get into more of what happened in the book in the spoiler section, but, absolutely a good read and fun, not the most, not the highest gravitas of material, but, a good adventure story and fun to read, and not trying to put on airs about itself kind of thing. So with that said, let's get into the spoiler section. All right, spoiler section. Since the plot is kind of the main fun of the story, I'm going to go a little light on spoilers, but I'll give you a kind of a synopsis and a few quotes. So, the main character goes to Ruritania. He decides to skip his train. He's kind of in this town called Zenda, which is a little ways away from the capital. He's supposed to go on train to the capital, but what he decides to do is actually walk through the forest to the next stop for the train and pick up the next train. But the idea is that someone's like, oh yeah, it turns out that the man who's going to be coronated as king is at this hunting lodge near Zenda, and, if you go through the forest, maybe you'll be lucky enough to see him and meet him. And so he's like, oh, well, and the odds are low, but I'll give it a shot. And so he goes and walks through the forest, and of course it turns out he does meet the king, and what he finds is that his red hair and long nose, as well as his build and the way he styles his hair and all that stuff, is actually exactly like the king. He's a spitting image. The king is, less than half an inch shorter and a little bit chubbier, but, not noticeably so. Not, people would easily confuse them two. And so after they kind of strike up a conversation and a little bit of a friendship there. And then they kind of decide, hey, why don't you come to the hunting lodge? We can have a feast and we can have some drinks, and then we can go to the coronation, and people will see 2 of us standing next to each other, and they'll all do double takes, and it'll be really funny. So we start out with this very kind of fun atmosphere. And even when things turn a little bit darker, because what ends up happening is that at the end of the night, they pull out one last bottle of wine, and the bottle of wine was given by Duke Black Michael to the king, and the king drinks the wine, and it turns out that the wine is drugged. And not like J.R.R. Martin drugged, just like, hey, he's gonna sleep too late to make it to the coronation kind of drugged. So even at this point, it's not like, dark and foreboding and horrible evil versus beneficent good. It's just like, oh, he did this thing so that maybe he'll get to be the king instead. But it didn't hurt anybody, right? And so it's like, okay, fine. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna have the main character attend the coronation, and we'll bring the king the next day. We'll do the switch. Everything will be fine. Nobody will ever know, and it'll be a fun adventure, kind of memory for you, the main character, says the two guys that are the king's bodyguards. And it starts fairly fun and happy. They kind of get on their horses and they start riding toward the city where they're going to get on the train, and then they get on the train. Quote, Sapt, without another word for the king, began at once to instruct me most minutely in the history of my past life. He told me the etiquette of the Ruritanian court, promising to be constantly at my elbow to point out everybody whom I ought to know, ... By the way, he said, you are a Catholic, I suppose? Not I answered. Lord, he's a heretic, groaned Sapt, and forthwith he fell to a rudimentary lesson in the practices and observances of the Romish faith. Luckily, said he, you won't be expected to know much, for the king is notoriously lax and careless about such matters. But you must be as civil as butter to the cardinal. We hope to win him over, because he and Michael have a standing quarrel about their precedence. End quote. So they get there. Everybody is very surprised to see the king, and of course everybody believes that the main character is the king. But the person who's most surprised is Black Michael himself. Quote, At last I was in the presence of my brother Black Michael, and when he saw me, his red cheeks went pale, all in a moment, and his helmet fell with a clatter, end quote. And so, Black Michael is not expecting him to be there. He's very surprised. And at this point, he doesn't necessarily know that something is awry. He's just like, oh, shoot, he's here. He's gonna get crowned. My plans are for naught. And it's still got a very, kind of fun atmosphere. Everybody's celebrating. It's a great coronation ceremony, big festival. Everybody's happy. And so the day goes on, and they're like, okay, cool. We're gonna take you back to we're gonna grab horses. We're gonna pretend you're in your bedroom sleeping. We're gonna get horses. We're gonna ride back to the hunting lodge. We're gonna do the switcheroo. I'll come back with a king. We'll have someone take you over to Zenda, and you can get on the train and go back to England, and everything will be fine. Oh, quote, so they have to sign a royal order. Quote, my dear colonel, I've not been bred a forger. And then they argue for a bit, and Sapt responds, if you can't manage a Rudolph in 10 minutes, why, I can. And so everything is still very lighthearted at this point. But in fact, when they arrive at the hunting lodge, they discover that not only did Black Michael drug the king, but he also went back to the lodge afterwards and kidnapped him as well. And this is where things start to get serious. Not only are they going to have to keep the main character pretending to be the king, but also Black Michael can't kill the king as long as the main character is there, because that would just cement him in his role. And so, like, they can't make any accusations. They're kind of at this weird Mexican standoff situation. And so the dangerous game begins. Black Michael and the Six versus the main character and the few loyal officers of the Ruritanian royalty who are helping him kind of, rescue the king. There's a bit of romance in the story that's handled pretty well. There's a situation where the Princess Flavia, she's the princess, and she's also kind of like the face of the capital city. Everybody in the capital city loves her very much, and he very much needs to kind of maintain a relationship with her. Otherwise, he might lose enough public approval that even if he was actually coronated, still his rule will not go very well because everyone will dislike him. And so the main character kind of is in this anomalous position where he has to kind of woo Flavia, but he can't but he also has to make sure that he's acting at the same time. And of course, this is kind of one of the issues that happens, is that he starts out acting and eventually he develops an actual affection for her. So here's his earlier kind of thoughts on it. Quote, "I had to keep the princess devoted to me and yet indifferent to me. I had to show affection for her and not feel it." So there's some of this going on. There's a little bit of like, he feels bad about it. At first he's like, I have to, kind of pretend to be in love with this woman that I don't know. And yet at the same time, she's beloved by the people for a good reason. And so he starts finding himself falling in love with her. And he's a little bit more, gallant than the actual king is too. And so she finds herself falling in love with him as well. And like actually kind of picking up on the differences between him and the king and singling those differences out as why she actually cares for him, which puts him in a really, hard position, basically. So what they discover eventually is that Black Michael has the king held prisoner in the castle at Zenda. And this is a castle that earlier in the book we learned about. Basically, it has this really cool drawbridge that comes back and forth on runners. And it's got a moat all around it, a very deep moat on a cliff kind of thing. And it's a very well-defended castle. They talk about how, whole armies could throw themselves against the castle and fail. It's one of the best defended castles that the main character knows of. Of course, the plan is to kill the king if cornered, right? If Black Michael is cornered, then he's like, well, we'll kill the king, and hopefully we'll kill the imposter, and then I can ascend to the throne. So we get some fun fights. We get sword and revolver fights. Some of them are serious. Some of them are more serious. Some of them are less serious. One of them that's less serious, there's a chapter called, I think the title of the chapter is something like "Undue Use for a Tea Table," right? And I'll just quote it. Quote, "I took up the little iron tea table, ... I'm going to cut out some fluff. The top, protruding in front of me, made a complete screen for my head and body, ... 3 shots rang out and battered into my shield. Another moment, and I leaped out, and the table caught them full and square. And in a tumbling, swearing, struggling mass, they and I and that brave table rolled down the steps." So, we get this confrontation where a few of the 6 have the main character trapped, and he decides to use this tea table to defend himself as he kind of knocks them down and then runs away. And, some of the fights are more serious than that, of course, but I thought this was a good example of how this book kind of straddles the line between serious and unserious in an effective way. So the remaining question of the book, once they discover that the king is in this castle at Zenda, is how to save him. And the situation is pretty dire. Quote, "Below the level of the ground in the castle, ... were situated 2 small rooms cut out of the rock itself. The outer of the 2 had no windows, ... The inner had 1 square window, which gave upon the moat. In this inner room there lay always, day and night, 3 of the 6. And the instructions of Duke Michael were that on any attack being made on the outer room, the 3 were to defend the door, ... Then Rupert Hentzau or Detchard should pass into the inner room and without more ado kill the king, ... So there's, the enemies are intelligent, they're well defended, they have a pretty good plan, they have a pretty good fortress, and so the rest of the book is about them figuring out how to, split them up variously, reduce the amount of guards, this kind of stuff. And it all happens pretty well and pretty fun, and there's a good action-packed kind of finale action scene, and then there's a really nice kind of breaking down the aftermath story, and it's very satisfyingly. I'm not going to spoil any more of that. If you want to know how they win, you'll have to read the book, but it is a free book, so I'll put a link in the description. Anyway, that'll do it for the spoiler section. Let's move on to the conclusion. In conclusion, this was a really fun read. It has a really good tone and a really good pace, and it kind of stays in the semi-serious mode most of the time. It starts out very bright, and there are some dark points, but, the ending is also very, it has a pretty happy ending kind of thing. There are some things that aren't especially happy, but, I'll leave that to you to read. It doesn't overdo anything. It doesn't try to self-parody itself. It's just a solid adventure story. A lot of, swashbuckling, swords and revolvers and castles and horseback fights and all kinds of fun stuff like that. It's just a really fun story to read, and I was actually impressed by it, especially since considering 1894, right? I mean, I was expecting it to be a little bit more dated in the use of language, but in all honesty, it was super easy to read the whole way through. There's humor in the dialogue, and there's a few funny situations. And at the same time, we have some fairly intelligent villains. We have a main character who is vulnerable and by no means overpowered. He's good with the sword, he's good with the revolver, but he's not invincible. He takes quite a few hard knocks throughout the course of the story. We have cool kind of like network of deceptions on both sides, right? Because the first deception is the main character pretending to be the king. That's the switcheroo. But then all the other deceptions that get layered onto this make a really fun kind of like, ooh, you know, this guy can't do this because if he does this, then this will happen, and this will happen. And fun stuff, just kind of fun plots and stuff like that. It has a satisfying climax. It's action-packed. It even gets a little bit frantic at times. And the ending is a good kind of drawdown of the tension to a relaxed ending that, you know, it kind of ends the story, but, you know, there are, in fact, 2 more sequels. You know, and I might have to check them out because they're actually pretty good, because this one was pretty good. So, yeah, this is The Prisoner of Zenda. And, yeah, I'll have links in the description to where you can find it if you want to give it a read. It's not super long. It took me a couple hours to read it last couple of days, something like that. And yeah, it's fun and just a great little adventure story that turned into something where if anybody has to name a fake European country, they call it Ruritania. Kind of a weird cultural artifact. And so I thought this was something fun to talk about. Anyway, that's what I've got for this time. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. You know, if you want to help support the channel, you know what to do. And I'll see you next time. Have a good one.